Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating look at the ultimate test of human resilience: existential threats. How exactly do societies anticipate them? How do we process them in the heat of the moment? And, how do we rebuild when the dust finally settles? To understand all of this, we're going to use the long, dark shadow of World War II as our lens, looking closely at those exact moments when the fate of the world basically hung in the balance. All right, let's get into it.
It's a pretty provocative question, isn't it? Can a stock market actually predict the end of the world? When we think of war, we usually picture armies and treaties, right? We rarely think about stock tickers or dividend yields. But financial markets are essentially these massive voting machines. They're constantly calculating risk and trying to predict the future. So today, we're going to explore exactly what happened to culture, capital, and public policy when entire nations were staring down a total apocalypse. The stakes literally do not get any higher than this.
So, here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Proxy war in the ring. 2. Blind to the apocalypse. 3. The markets that survived. 4. Blueprint for post-war peace. And finally, 5. The left behind.
Let's start with Section 1, Proxy War in the Ring, 1938, Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling. Let's wind the clock all the way back to 1938. Well before the armies of the world formally met on the battlefield, the ideological clash of the century played out in a much more intimate setting, a boxing ring. And this is a brilliant example of how individuals can suddenly become symbols for massive political regimes. On one side, you've got Joe Louis. He was the son of Alabama sharecroppers who became this massive crossover hero in America. And he wasn't just fighting for himself. He carried the immense hopes of African Americans and quite literally stood as the standard bearer for American democracy. On the other side was Max Schmeling. He was a German who had previously been embraced by Berlin's avant-garde scene, but by 1938, he'd been thrust into this incredibly awkward, reluctant role of Hitler's favorite boxer. This fight was framed as a demonstration of Hitler's racial theories on a global stage. The pressure sitting on both of these men's shoulders was just absolutely staggering. So they meet on June 22nd, 1938. And this was actually a rematch. Schmeling had beaten Louis back in 1936. But this time around, the world was a completely different place. War was looming. You had 90,000 fans crammed into Yankee Stadium, and literally the largest radio audience in human history tuned in. And what they heard was, as one commentator famously put it, 2 minutes and 4 seconds of murder. Louis delivered a completely devastating, decisive victory. This massive cultural proxy war was over in a flash, and it set a really defiant tone for the democratic world. Moving on to Section 2, Blind to the Apocalypse, Unseen Financial Ruin. Zooming out from that boxing ring to the financial capitals of Europe, we really need to define exactly what investors were facing back then. Apocalyptic risk. We're not talking about your standard economic recession or, a bad earnings quarter. This is the risk posed by an event, like a full-scale military invasion, that leads to the total collapse of a country's political system. Because when human, civil, and property rights are completely abrogated, a financial market effectively ceases to exist. Your assets go to zero. Without civil rights, there is simply no free market.
So you have to ask, how did nations process this impending doom? Well, mostly through a massive disconnect between public sentiment and capital reality. It's a stark contrast. Over in Poland, a massive daily newspaper was printing these incredibly optimistic headlines right before the invasion, telling people the Axis had absolutely no chance to win. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Polish stock market had entered a secular decline, dropping over 23%. It was the same story in France. Newspapers were reporting that general mobilization was continuing calmly, but underneath all that patriotic, comforting propaganda, the French stock index was getting absolutely hammered. Consider the timing of a massive 24.9% structural drop in the French stock market. That didn't happen until May 1940, right as the Battle of France actually began and Belgium capitulated. The market had been enjoying these brief relief rallies right up until the very end. It goes to show that capital markets, for all their supposed predictive power and wisdom, largely failed to foresee the true, terrifying scale of the coming apocalypse until the tanks were practically rolling across the borders. And the physical reality of that apocalyptic risk is incredibly sobering, because this isn't just numbers on a ledger we're talking about. Think about the Warsaw Stock Exchange in 1939, existing as a bustling financial hub one day and reduced to absolute rubble by German bombs the next. When a nation loses its sovereignty and its underlying property rights are erased, the very physical institutions that uphold its wealth are destroyed right along with them. Which brings us to Section 3, the markets that survived. The UK and Sweden process the threat.
Now, not every nation succumbed to the threat. It's really interesting to see how the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Sweden process these massive existential crises. Sweden, in particular, found itself in a uniquely terrifying geographical position. They were essentially an island in a German sea, completely surrounded by occupied Norway, Denmark, Poland, and an aligned Finland. As events unfolded in real time, the threats mounted incredibly fast. You have the Soviet-Finnish Winter War kicking off in late 1939. By April 1940, neighboring Norway falls to Germany, which immediately sends the Swedish stock market plummeting over 36% from its pre-war levels. I mean, the existential dread was just palpable.
But then comes June 1941, an event historians call the Midsummer Crisis. Germany demands that Sweden allow the transit of armed German troops right through its territory to attack the Soviet Union. This is a flagrant violation of Swedish neutrality. It's a massive political crisis. So you'd completely expect the markets to panic and tank, right? But incredibly, the Swedish stock market actually gained 6.5%. Why? Because by giving in to the demand, the immediate pressing risk of a German military invasion evaporated. The market experienced a relief rally. It's a really fascinating look at how capital sometimes values sheer survival and certainty over national honor.
Ultimately, Sweden survived the war. And because they managed to maintain their independence and their civil rights, their markets bounced back. After hitting that terrifying panic-induced low in 1940, the Swedish equity market rallied, and it actually finished in 1945 roughly 12.2% above its initial 1938 value. It is a striking picture of market resilience when a country manages to successfully navigate an apocalyptic risk.
Section 4, Blueprint for Post-War Peace, the 1944 GI Bill.
So, once the apocalyptic threat of the Axis powers was finally neutralized, surviving nations faced a completely new challenge. How on earth do you rebuild? In the United States, the blueprint for that was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. We all know it better as the GI Bill. Now, while the war was still actively being fought, the U.S. government realized that 15 million men and women would soon be returning home, and they were all going to need jobs. To prevent mass unemployment and a potential economic collapse, this act provided unprecedented federal funds directly to veterans for college, housing, and job training. The sheer scale of this investment was staggering. To put it in perspective, by 1956, the education and training portion of the GI Bill alone had disbursed $14.5 billion. But here's the thing, it wasn't just a handout, it was a true investment. The Veterans Administration later estimated that the resulting increase in federal income taxes generated by these newly educated, higher-earning citizens actually paid for the total cost of the bill several times over. The impact of those dollars was just transformational. 8 million veterans utilized the program. Over 2 million flooded into colleges and universities, which fundamentally democratized higher education in America. By 1955, 4.3 million home loans had been granted. That meant veterans were responsible for buying an incredible 20% of all new post-war homes. This single policy essentially staved off a new depression and engineered unparalleled generational prosperity. It virtually created the modern American middle class as we know it.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the left behind, the lingering injustice.
As we analyze how societies rebuild from crisis, it's absolutely crucial to look at who actually gets included in that rebuild. The prosperity of the GI Bill was massive, for sure, but it was not distributed equally. On paper, the benefits were available to all veterans, but in practice, the implementation was heavily shaped by local systemic discrimination. White veterans were easily able to use their guaranteed loans to gain access to a booming suburban housing market, laying a rock-solid foundation for generational wealth. Conversely, Black veterans found themselves systemically excluded. They were kept out of new suburban developments, and deeply prejudiced lending practices made it incredibly difficult to secure mortgages for homes even within their own neighborhoods. The historical record on this is very clear. As the National Archives details, Black vets faced prejudice that overwhelmingly excluded them from the post-war housing boom. So the very same economic miracle that defined the post-war era, the miracle that saved the American economy from backsliding into a depression, also unfortunately deepened a structural racial wealth gap that persists to this very day.
From the boxing ring to the stock exchange to the halls of Congress, the ways a society confronts, processes, and ultimately recovers from a crisis tell us everything about its values, its fears, and its blind spots. Markets can be terrifyingly slow to see the apocalypse coming, and policies built for peace can harbor hidden inequalities that last for generations. So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When future historians look back at the crises we are living through right now, What will our markets, our cultural proxy wars, and our policies say about us? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll talk to you next time.